maternal grandmother, Mrs. Street, had a maternity hospital in Caledonian Ave in the very early 20th century. How I first came to know about Mr. Leibe is I purchased the first edition of 5 Graves in Dalwallinu for my father-in-law. And at that time, in 1989, nobody much in Wubin that I knew of, talked very much about Mr. Leibe, and that's come later. Rod's father came to Jibberding, the area where we farm, as a 4-year-old in early 1909, so he did know Mr. Leibe, who came in 1908. But unfortunately, we don't have Rod's father's memories on tap. You always think, oh, you should have asked more questions when the people were there. But Rod thought that perhaps his dad had worked for Mr. Leibe at some stage, and I know that lots of local people had. When we were collecting information in Wubin for, it's called Prepared to Pioneer, a history of Wubin from 1908 to 1939, I found out that Rod's grandparents were noted down and they were investigated as being German sympathisers, because there were quite a few German people living in Wubin at that time, including Mr. Leibe. And later, as an Australian citizen, Gus Leibe was furious when his partner, Wilhelm Klein, was interned on Rottnest Island when there was such a feeling against the German people in the First World War. And I wondered if it was possibly because of that anti-German feeling that Mr. Leibe had already been in Wubin, I know, but I wondered if that's what made him perhaps turn more to farming, because coming back to the city, I know people weren't as friendly as they had been towards him in the earlier times. All German people, of course. And when this Prepared to Pioneer was launched in 2005, we were delighted that Mrs. Edna Chapman, who is the daughter of Wilhelm and Elizabeth Klein, Wilhelm Klein was Leibe's partner in the farming that they had in Wubin, was able to attend, and she was 98 years old. She talked about playing with Rod's father. They were the only children in the district in the very early days. And it was lovely to meet her, and it was a special day for her, and I thought it was great that she even wrote at 98 to say thank you and how much she'd enjoyed it all. And I thought I might just read a little bit from this booklet, which is a souvenir official brochure, the Commonwealth of Australia Jubilee Celebrations 1901 to 1951, was put out by the Dalwallinu District's Road Board. It's talking about the early days in the area. Wubin is part of the Dalwallinu Shire, and it lists the people who were early settlers in the district. The first man to produce 100,000 bags of wheat in one season. The first individual farmer to produce over 100,000 bags of wheat in one season in the world was Mr. F.W.G. Leibe, who arrived in the Wubin district in 1908 and began producing wheat a year later. He originally farmed on 2 blocks east of Wubin, which was named after his original property. It was not long before Mr. Leibe was farming in a big way, and at one time he had 32 machines taking off bumper harvests. In one season, 1923, he had 10 horse teams operating in the harvesting of the golden grain, but he turned to power farming in succeeding years, having no less than 32 tractors on his properties at Waddy Forest and Wubin. It was in the season of 1929 that he produced 102,000 bags of wheat, this coming from his farms at Wubin and Waddy Forest. In 1908, Mr. Leibe took up 16,000 acres of land at Wubin and thus began a farming career which made him world famous. In 1925, he purchased 50,000 acres of land at Waddy Forest and at 63 years of age proceeded to turn virgin forest into a prolific wheat-producing property. By 1929-30, he had 21,000 acres under crop, 15,000 being at Waddy Forest and 6,000 at Wubin. His fuel account for this season was £11,000, as he used 32 tractors, each with its farm implement, and 12 large motor trucks. He also went in for sheep, and in 1944 he secured 465 bales of wool. At one period at Waddy Forest, he employed 101 men in clearing operations and 40 farm workers. In 1948, he owned 50,412 acres of land. In addition to possessing great farming ability, the late Mr. Leibe was an architect and builder of the very highest degree. He erected several beautiful houses in the Wubin district, but the one which will ever be a monument to his skill and foresight is the magnificent homestead occupied by Mrs. A.H. Collins and her sons Albert and Sydney on their 13,000-acre excellent property there. Wubin and Dalwallinu Road Board district will ever remember Mr. Leibe with pride, as he laid a solid foundation stone in his efforts to build it. Mr. Leibe looked to the provision of water on his properties and constructed an 18,000-yard dam at Wubin. Mr. Leibe's production of 102,000 bags of wheat is the world record for one man. I think they were emphasising that it really was something. There's photos there, I'll leave them on the table. Mr. Leibe and some of his horse teams, one of the houses, and at the back, on the very last page, there's a photo of the dam. And I have two lovely photos here. Wubin had a centenary in 1908, not so long ago, and we were lucky to have some of the Klein descendants come, and one lady came and she was a member of the Honour family living at Narrogin, and she just gave us this photo, which is the special homestead, the one mentioned, and another one, which I'll show in a moment, of a group of farm workers. And I do remember going to a garden party at this house many years ago, when Albert Collins, one of the sons, and his wife Gisela were there. And unfortunately I can't remember anything much about the house except that it was large. And there are 3 houses still in the district. Only one is lived in. I haven't seen this one recently. One of them's in fairly bad disrepair, unfortunately. And we did have people from the Museums Association who just thought it would be wonderful if the house could be restored, and it would be, but the amount of money it had cost, I don't know that it's going to happen. And when Wubin Progress Association opened a museum in the heritage-listed 1939 wheat bin in Wubin in 1997, a display board was set up with information, photos, etc. relating to Mr. Leibe's history. We also have a DVD that has photos of Mr. Leibe on also, and I didn't know if it was for my or our benefit that on the back of our last newsletter you had a little bit of the bulk handling, because that's exactly what our wheat bin museum is showing, the transition from the bags to the bulk handling. So thank you for that. That was very nice that it was there. And just at our last committee meeting last Friday, one of our members had been to Whiteman Park and seen a very good DVD made about, I think it was the truck exhibition or something there. She spoke to the person and wondered if we could manage to have something done like that, just with Leibe photos telling his story. It's several $1,000s, but we might get it done, because we're very fortunate in Wubin. I'm going away from Mr. Leibe briefly, but we do have a bachelor man who has lots of machinery and is interested in finding it a home, and he lets our Progress Association crop his farm. Members do it. So we have an income coming in, as well as the donations that we get from people visiting. So we're very fortunate that we're able to do things. And getting back to Mr. Leibe, I asked a 96-year-old friend if she could recall anything about Mr. Leibe, and she said he was a gentleman, and she remembered him bowing to her. She thought he was the only man who'd ever bowed to her. But in those days, men were gentlemen, didn't they? Weren't they? They lifted their hats to ladies and that, yes. Before the second edition of the 5 Graves was printed, Stan Jervis and Terry Spence came up to Wubin and spoke to us, managed to get some more photos and that, and they've acknowledged it in the back of this book. We've even got a photo in there. So. And now the name Leibe is very well known in rural areas, as some forward-thinking farmers formed a group for progressive local grassroots research in agriculture and took the name of that most innovative, progressive farmer who put Wubin and Waddy Forest areas on the map in the 1920s. The group meets in the small town of Bunteen between the 2 former Leibe properties. And it is at the Bunteen School many years ago that Mr. Leibe used to visit and give the delighted children 6pence each. I'm sure they were delighted. And I have here, just if you wanted to look at it too, it shows what this group does, heaps of things. And this is from not just a local paper, this is from the Farm Weekly that goes out to all rural areas. They have all sorts of things. So the Leibe name will continue on. And I'll get out the last photo. Oh, talking about the houses, the 3 houses still there. And we've also been, and I think, Frank, did you mention you've been to Carnamar and on the Waddy Forest properties?
Yes.
The sheds are there too. This, pardon? Oh, goodness me. This is Mr. Leibe here, and they're written down there who the various people are, clients and...
We just hold it still.
Still?
Yes, good, thank you.
Good. So you're most welcome to come up and have a look. The Kleins, I think, enjoyed social activities as were available in those days, picnics and things like that. Mr. Levy never married, of course, but he had a lot to do with the Klein families. And I think that's just about all I've got, but I'm very happy to, if I can, answer any questions.
Folks, has anyone any questions they might like to ask Judith?
I'd just like to contribute an experience I had at Waddy Forest. One of my friends, the Adams family of Adams, his father, after World War II, was settled on one of the farms that had been developed by leibe. And he had the way of making a very giant shed. And I was amazed at the salmon guns, the sandalwood posts of this shed. It was a huge shed. One part of one corner was given over to being a house. The rest was reserved for machinery. And it had this large roof, and the water was collected in a very large tank. And it all seemed to be environmentally sort of self-supporting. The other thing I noticed particularly was the fencing. Even after all those years, the fencing was still something that was in reasonably good condition. And he had boards down the bottom of the wire fence, and I was told that was some sort of a barrier to rabbits. Don't know whether he was keeping the rabbits inside or outside. I was very impressed with and I believe he repeated this pattern over quite a few farms.